The Storybook Puppet Theater at Children's Fairyland in Oakland, California is the oldest continuously performing puppet theater in the United States. Randal Metz is the director of the Storybook Puppet Theater, and he is my guest on this episode of Under the Puppet. You're listening to Saturday Morning Media. And now, back to our show. Under the Puppet is made possible by the Saturday Morning Media Patreon patrons. To support the show and hear new episodes before anyone else, become a patron. Visit patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media for more information. And thank you for your support. Welcome to the show that talks to puppeteers about the art and business of puppetry. My name is Grandpa Choco, and this is Under the Puppet. Welcome to Under the Puppet. For this episode's interview, I traveled to Children's Fairyland in Oakland, California to interview Randal Metz, the director of the Storybook Puppet Theater, the oldest continuously operating puppet theater in the United States. Randal and I sat down in the Storybook Theater's puppet workshop on a rainy Saturday afternoon to discuss his puppetry career and his history with Children's Fairyland. Randal Metz, welcome to Under the Puppet, and thank you so much for having me here, hosting me in the actual Storybook Theater workshop here at Children's Fairyland.
Oh, no problem, Grant. Great to have you here.
Well, I'm so excited to talk to you. You and I met last year, and I knew the moment I met you, I wanted to have you on the show because the day that we met you, you gave us such a wonderful tour, and your wealth of knowledge of not only just the history of the Storybook Theater, but the entire world of puppetry is amazing, and I'm very excited to talk to you today.
Well, I was fortunate enough to have grown up in that world from 1970 on. I'm actually approaching my 50th year here at Fairyland.
Wow.
So I've met a lot of people.
Yeah, well, we're going to get to some of those people, but I always start by asking, do you remember your first exposure to puppetry?
Well, my first exposure to puppetry was when I was 6 years old. I was unfortunately diagnosed with a kidney nephritis. I used to hang around my grandmother who did a lot of art projects, and she would always spray with paints in the backyard. And as a kid, I'd go running back there and smelling the paints. Little did I know it would probably shut down my kidneys. So I ended up at 6 being stuck in the hospital for a 6-week period and then at home. And during that time period, my grandmother, she found a Mother's Day magazine on how to make popsicle cutout puppets, where you cut out the paper and put it on a popsicle stick, and then you perform the show. And the show that she did was the Nutcracker. And so I remember being 6 years old, and we cut out all the paper, made the puppets, and then she sat by my bedside, and she put the record player on with the Nutcracker music, and we'd act out the story of the Nutcracker. So that was really my first exposure to puppetry.
Yeah.
Years ago.
And then you also had a moment here at Fairyland, too, right, that inspired you?
Of course, yes. When I was 10 going on 11, I came to Fairyland in 1970 and saw Louis Malman's production of Treasure Island. And the puppets just spoke to me. They were amazing. A very rough cut with burlap hair and unsmooth faces and beautiful costumes by Frances Osnowitz, who was Frank Oz's mother. And the puppets were just really took me away. And it was at that moment that I said, I'm going to be a puppeteer. And that was it.
Yeah. And were your parents creative and supportive of your want to be a puppeteer?
My parents were not on the creative side. My grandmother was. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, my parents were divorcing at that time. And so I was kind of unsure of where to go, which is why I fell into puppetry and fell into Fairyland here. I used it as a way to express myself, to not be lost in a family that was splitting up at that time.
Right. And can you give us, this could be a whole show on itself, but can you give us maybe like a brief history about Children's Fairyland and the Storybook Theater, maybe for those who have never heard of it before?
Well, Fairyland opened up on September 2nd, 1950, and it was the first park of its kind. It was fashioned after a Detroit park in Belle Isle, which had animal cages which were shaped like fairy tale sets. And they said, we can do this here in Oakland, only they went one further. They used the fairy tale setting to not only have animals, but to incorporate flowers and fauna, and then entertainment like the Puppet Theater. Puppet Theater opened in 1956. And that was because the puppets were so popular here at the park. So from 1950 to 55, we had entertainers who were puppeteers here, but they weren't going to become the directors of our theater. In 1956, the theater opened up, and we've only had 5 directors over that time period. Very briefly, Frank and Dorothy Hayward, who had it for a year, and then Frank passed away, and Dorothy didn't know what she was going to do, and Bob Mills and Tony Urbano came here, and Tony Urbano took over the theater after Dorothy left, and then after Tony left, after 4 years, Lumen Code came in, and he ran it for 4 years here at the theater. And then in 1967, Louis Mollman took over, and Louis ran it from 1967 to 2005.
Wow.
And then I was his apprentice, and then he and I both ran the theater together from 1991 to 2005 as co-directors, and then I've run it ever since after Louis passed away in 2014.
Yeah, so it is the oldest continuously performing puppet theater in the United States.
The
right?
oldest continuously performing puppet theater, 63 years.
Wow.
And we've always had a performance unless it rained.
Right.
So we are continuous.
Well, now, your first job here at Fairyland, funnily enough, when you were a kid, was not involved with the puppet theater, right?
No. My first job here when I was 10 was actually as a child actor. And much like Alice Deneen, who you interviewed already, she was Winnie the Pooh. I was the Mad Hatter. And I used it as a means to get into the theater. And this was the best way to do it, was to hang around Fairyland, which allowed me to hang around the puppet theater at the same time.
Right.
So I was very lucky. And then from there, they just saw I could do a lot of things. So I ended up becoming artistic director for the park. And for 20 years, I designed sets, wrote plays, taught children, did everything, publicity, events, as well as being involved in the puppet theater here. And that sort of was my bread and butter job.
Yeah.
Louis always said, you need a bread and butter job. Puppetry may be the thing you like to do, but you got to have a job or something on the side that's going to pay your bills while you're following your dreams.
Right.
And luckily Fairyland was that, which is why I've been here so long.
Yeah, well, that's not a bad job. I mean, we think about, not that office jobs are bad, but I'd rather work here at Fairyland than work in an office.
Oh, it's lots of fun here.
Yeah. Now, you just didn't run away and join Fairyland. You also went to college and you studied theater arts, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I got my degree from San Francisco State University. I went over there because William Stewart Jones was in charge of makeup and costuming for the theater department, and he was a puppeteer also, and I wanted to be around puppeteers and learn theater. Here at Fairyland, all of the shows that we do, we approach it from the idea that the puppeteer is creating his own theater, in terms of the idea that we write the show, we design the sets, we paint the sets, we construct everything that's needed here. It's only a 20-minute production, but we are a miniature theater for kids. We like to look at ourselves as being the first theater that children will see.
Yeah.
It's very, very simple. It's very, very elegant in a lot of other ways, too, because we can do anything from a simple 3 pigs all the way to the magic flute or Coppelia, the ballet. We have a very wide range here at Fairyland. But we do want to do it in a theatrical way, which is why I went to San Francisco State to study theater and children's theater.
Yeah, well, I have vivid memories of being here as a kid because I grew up in the Bay Area and seeing a puppet show. I can't tell you, unfortunately, which one it was, but seeing the show here at Fairyland. Would you recommend that puppeteers study acting and directing as you did to help with their performance?
Yes, I'd recommend that serious puppeteers study everything, because you never know what's going to be affecting you on down the line. At one time, I studied Commedia dell'arte, and I was out performing some commedia. And sure enough, years later, I was doing a puppet show in the style of Commedia dell'arte. Who knew?
Right.
It's just something that was there. But I think that the nice thing about, especially when you're younger, is that these opportunities present themselves to do things other than what you would normally think you want to do. Take them all.
Yeah.
Because in one way or another, they're going to come back and you're going to use what you learned in the future.
Yeah.
Just no matter where.
You may learn something or you may stumble across something that you really love and that you never would have found out otherwise.
Exactly.
Just watching your normal television channels or whatever. Yeah. Can you tell us about the first time you met Louis Malman, the director of the Puppet Theater here?
Well, I first met Louis, as I said, back in 1970. And he'd just done a performance of Treasure Island. And he allowed me to come backstage, like he did a lot of youth, to see the puppets. And I got to see them up close. And then I went away. And I sang, how can I be a puppeteer? Louis, he's a very kind man. I worked with him for 40 years. Well, my parents went away to Tijuana for a little trip that weekend. And they were selling little tiny marionettes at the border, $1 a piece. So my mother bought me a lot of these little marionettes. And I came home with the idea, I know how to be a puppeteer. I'm going to go back to Louis, and I'm going to offer him $1 a piece for each of the puppets in the Treasure Island show. Because, obviously, in my mind, puppets are only $1 a piece.
$1 a piece, right.
And, of course, the show was closing, so he wasn't going to use them anymore. So I knocked on the door, and I said, hi, remember me? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, well, I would like to buy your puppets for $1 a piece. And rather than, telling me to get lost or go away, he told me he would love to sell them to me, but we'd be doing the show again here at Fairyland, so he would need to keep them at the Puppet Theater. However, since I couldn't buy them from them, I could come back anytime that I wanted and play with them or see what he was doing. And it was a door being opened for me as a 10, 11-year-old at that time to step into the world of puppetry and actually learn from a professional puppeteer, which I did. Now, it's ironic that when I left years later to go to L.A. and work with Bob Baker for a while, that Louis handed me this big box. And I said, what's this? And he says, this is a going-away gift for you. And I opened it up, and inside were all of the marionettes for Treasure Island. And he said, here, I want you to have these, but I want you to have them so you will remember where you came from and remember your roots.
Yeah.
And what we've been doing all these years. And so when I was in L.A., they hung in my apartment to remind me, oh, yeah, this is why I wanted to be a puppeteer.
Right.
And sort of as a roadmap to get me home again.
Did you pay him $1 for this?
No,
you didn't. Okay, adjusted for inflation.
But after he gave them to me and he wanted to do the show here at Fairyland, I allowed him to do the show without him having to pay any rent on the puppets.
Oh, that's very nice of you. You're very kind.
We kind of worked well together that way.
Yeah. Well, it seems that Louis was very influential to you and your career. Can you tell us maybe some puppetry advice he gave you or some lesson he taught you that you still use in the show today?
Oh, boy. Yeah. Well, I guess the most important lesson he taught me is never be afraid to ask. Never be afraid to voice what it is you would like to know from someone else. Because he said the worst they can say is no.
Right.
And that's it. He says, don't be afraid. Just go up and ask somebody a question. And go, okay, if they say no. The other thing he said is whenever you have an idea or a project you want to bring forth, think of it in 3 different ways. In other words, if you want to get something and you want to present a project, present it first as the way you want to do it. But then if somebody's not receptive to it, have a way to go back. Okay, where's your second line of defense? What will you settle for? And if that doesn't work, then what's your final? What's the final thing you'd like to see done or the final thing you'll accept? So he was always a very practical man in offering that sort of advice.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of the other puppeteers who apprenticed alongside of you here while you were working at the Storybook Theater?
Well, okay. You've talked to Alice Deneen. Mm-hmm. She was here in her youth. At the time that I was here, we didn't have a lot of apprentices at the theater. I was just ending my career as a Mad Hatter here at Fairyland, and I wanted to stay, and they didn't know what to do with me. And there were a couple of other young men that wanted to learn about puppetry too. So Louis said, let's start a junior guild. Junior guild being all these young guys that would come to the theater here, learn puppetry, but still help out at Fairyland and doing other things. Amongst that group was Mike Davis. Only it took me a long time to figure out that Mike Davis eventually became Michael Earl. Mm-hmm. But Mike Davis was a young man my age who was apprenticing here at Fairyland at the time. In fact, he and I put together a show, Christmas Carol, for the Junior Guild Productions, where he did all the heads for the show and I did all the bodies and wrote the script. And it was exciting to work with Michael when he was here. He didn't get to come down a lot because he lived in Livermore at the time, and Livermore's about 30 miles away. So he wasn't here every weekend like the rest of us were.
Right.
The other young talent that was here was John Gilkerson, who you may hear from time to time. He unfortunately has passed away, but he was a great, great talent. He not only was a puppeteer, but he dressed several ballet companies, Harlem Dance Theater, the Vienna group. He was involved with them, the Oakland Ballet. But he did a show here called Buster and Me, which was a TV show. And he not only made the puppets for the show, but he played the role of Russell the orangutan.
Yep.
In there.
Yep, that's one I watched every week.
You watched
when I was
that
growing
show?
up here, yeah.
Yeah, well, that was John handling most of that stuff. He was a little older than me, so he was a year ahead of me as far as Lewis was concerned with his apprentices. And probably he would have been where I am today, except he decided that he wanted to go into theater, and he was a singer, dancer. His best friend was Tom Hanks in high school. The two of them did My Fair Lady together, where they were the professor and Pickering. So they grew up together. And in fact, when Tom Hanks won the Academy Award for Philadelphia, he thanked John Gilkerson for showing a gay lifestyle and a positive attitude for him as sort of a role model for that role. But John, unfortunately, is no longer with us, and Michael Earl has unfortunately passed away. So that leaves me at the moment.
Well, in 1991, you formed a production company with Louis Malman, and you began co-directing the Puppet Theater. Is that right?
That's correct. 1991. Louis wanted me to take over the job here at the theater, and he thought that the best way to do that was to get my name on the contracts. So he went and he said, we want to form a new company, and he called it M+M Productions. If you talked to him, it was Malman and Metz. If you talked to me, it was Metz and Malman. Right. Just depending on who you were talking to at the time. But it was a way to get me a foot in the door here at the theater. That's what we did. We formed this company, and it stayed there until 2005 when Louis officially retired. And at 2006, I turned it to my own company, the Puppet Company.
Right. Let me ask you about having a mentor, because I think a lot of times this day and age, especially like, I don't know, kind of growing up, I was always interested in puppets, and I don't think it was until, well, much later, the mid-2000s, that I finally, had some people to teach me. But how important it is to kind of seek out, if there's one in your area, to seek out a mentor and work with them?
Oh, it's great to have a mentor, to have somebody you can take your work to and say, is this good? And they'll say, well, try it this way. I have a young apprentice right now whom I'm trying to teach, and he is so much into just getting the job done. And I'm trying to pull him back and say, no, take the steps. Do it this way first. Right. Do the basics. Once you got the basics, do the rest. But if you don't have that mentor, you make the mistakes and you have no one to bounce the ideas off of. And the more mentors you can have more than one.
Right.
Because there are so many out there that can teach so many different things. I was lucky enough to have 4 on my career.
Well, I wanted to ask, you studied with Bay Area puppeteer Letty Connell-Schubert. And can you tell us a little bit about who she was and her importance in the world of puppetry?
Sure. Letty started with Ralph Chassé. She was trained by Ralph, and she used to do the Brother Buzz TV show with him here in the Bay Area, where she was Miss Busybee, one of the characters in it. And she used to have a toy shop. Her and her husband ran one in San Francisco, where she had a dog puppet that she used to perform in the windows and get an attraction, get a crowd to get there and see what was up at the toy shop, until the city asked her to stop performing in the windows because traffic was stopping. Right. Wasn't a good thing. But Letty became the grandmother of us here. She started taking young talent, and she started coaching them and being interested in their careers. Amongst the people that she actually got started in careers were Jerry Juhl and Frank Oz, who were teenagers working with her on what is the Vagabond Puppets of Oakland. Now, the Vagabond Puppets is one of the oldest puppet touring programs to parks and recreation centers in America. It ran actually from 1948 all the way to 2015.
Wow.
68 years of summer activities. It started with a WPA work project, and then the puppets were used on into the years, and other puppeteers took their places, like Letty, who ran it for about 6 years, and then Jerry and Frank, who were teenagers, took it over in 1960, just before they met Jim Henson, and they ran it for 2 years. Well, actually, Jerry and Frank ran it for 1 year, and Frank ran it for the next year because Jerry took off to go join Jim in New York.
Yeah.
And Frank couldn't because he was still in high school.
Right.
But Letty trained them, gave them guidance, and shaped their careers. And she did that for many, many, many people in the Bay Area, many puppeteers. And she did that all the way up until her passing in about 2003, I think, is when we lost her. But she's one of our greats here in the Bay Area.
Yeah, and you worked with her. You worked under her, studied with her.
I worked with her. I was fortunate enough to take one of her Vagabond puppet shows, and she came back to Fairyland, and she redesigned it for us, and she rewrote the script with me, and we presented it here at Fairyland, and she even did the title character in the voice soundtrack.
Wow.
So it was really nice to get her input all the way through.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you mentioned Jerry Juhl, and you worked very closely with him, too, and he was a friend, right?
Yes, he was a friend of the Puppet Theater in here, having been an Oakland boy himself. My first experience with Jerry was at a 1975 regional festival. I was 17 at the time. I really didn't know too much about him, but I was performing Snow White, which was pretty much a 17-year-old's viewpoint of the story. It was very much nonconformist. It went in many different directions, and it became pretty much a success of that convention. And after I'd performed it, I was taking Jerry's class on how to write puppet shows, and he started talking, and then he says, I want to take that show that we just saw, and I want to use it as an example of how to write a puppet show. And, of course, I said, that was my show. And he said, really? Well, congratulations. He said, we need to talk. And we became good friends from that point on. And I was lucky enough to work with him again. I took this seminar. It was called the Survey of Puppet Theater Techniques. It was in 1994, taught by the Muppets. It was at Humboldt College here in California. And it was a 2-week intensive course on puppetry. I liked it because it wasn't about the Muppets. We had a seminar in there where we were working, and he was teaching writing, and Dave Goltz came in and brought Gonzo, and we had to perform with Gonzo on stage at one point. But the whole idea of the class was to take puppetry from putting a styrofoam ball on your finger and making a character with your hand, all the way through marionettes, rod puppets, avant-garde theater, film, stage, technique. 2 weeks of really looking at puppetry in a different way. And, of course, Jerry was teaching the writing aspects. So I got to work with him again there. And when I wrote my book, Storybook Strings, he did the foreword for me for that, talking about what it was like to be in the Bay Area as a youth and growing up around Fairyland and all that stuff. So he's sort of been one of those mentors where I just had a question, I'd call him up, and he'd give me an answer.
Right.
He was very giving, very kind. I really like working with him.
Yeah, well, his sense of humor, I mean, in my opinion, made the Muppets what they are. I mean, because he was such a brilliant writer. Are there any lessons that you learned from him that you still kind of use today?
Just keep it fast, keep it funny.
Keep it fast, keep it funny. There you go.
And always make sure that your dialogue is never overpowering your action. Because if he used to say, take a puppet script, put your dialogue on one side of the script, and then put your action or what's happening on the other side. If you just have pages and pages of talking, you're going the wrong way.
Wow, yeah.
You have to have action.
Yeah.
It's particularly true with kids here today. When we design a puppet show, we'll often write for the adults like he did with the jokes and the humor, the puns, and all the slapstick. But all of the action and the scenery, colors are for the little kids.
Yeah.
Because they won't get the jokes all the time.
Right.
I think that's true with the Muppets, too. They were very slapsticky, and they did a lot of adult humor,
Right.
which the kids didn't always get, but they loved the hitting, the Punch and Judy antics, and the scenery, and the actual action of what was happening.
Yeah. And do you, I believe you said this, and I could be mistaken, but when we were here before, you mentioned that there's still pieces that Jerry wrote that you will perform from time to time here at the Storybook Theater?
Yes, we just did one of his shows. Actually, there was a debate going on between Jerry and Frank as to who wrote the show. It was called The Dragon Who Wasn't, and it was a Vagabond puppet show. And I read the script, and it was hysterical. It was right along the same lines as The Frog Prince and Hey Cinderella and The Muppet Musicians of Bremen. It was that same style of humor, much like that. And I said, well, I'd like to redo it again. And so we called up Jerry and we called up Frank and we said, can we do this? And to tell you the truth, neither one of them could remember who wrote it. Frank said, oh, I think I might have wrote it, but I was so influenced by him. And Jerry was saying, well, I might have wrote it, but Frank maybe did. I was influenced by him. So it's one of their tales.
Yeah. Those two guys, neither of them want to steal the credit.
Yeah.
Because it's called me. I was just going, yeah, I wrote it. How much, what are you going to do with it?
But it was a funny show. And the funny thing is we took the story and we gender changed it. So the story was about a young scribe who goes and captures a dragon and gets to marry a princess. So we changed it from a young woman who goes and captures the dragon and gets to marry a prince.
Right.
So we gender changed everything. The king became the queen, and the wizard became a wizardess, and all that sort of stuff.
And didn't you say that the princess in the original was sort of flighty and maybe like written very...
yes,
bimbo-ish,
yes,
to use a term. And then when you switched it to a prince, it made it very funny, right? That's what you said.
The princess would just run through the scenes going, ah. So we changed it to the prince, and the prince was now the one running through the scenes going, the audience loved it.
Yeah.
It's just why would you want to marry that prince?
Right. Exactly.
But he was the prince.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier that the M+M company later changed to the Puppet Company. What advice would you give to someone who wanted to start their own puppet company?
Wow, I'd say just do it. Interesting. Again, when you're in your youth, so many things come up, and you should just jump at every opportunity. And I was just out of high school, and the guy who ran Fairyland, William Penmont Jr., was in charge of the Nolan Park Zoo, the Oakland Zoo. And the Fairyland Puppet Theater had been so successful, he said we should have one at the baby zoo. So right out of high school, I had to become the puppet company in order to sign the contracts to be the puppeteer at the Oakland Zoo for 2 years, which is what I did. And I just snowballed from there. I just decided that was great. So definitely jump at every opportunity you can get. Start your company, make a name for yourself, start to be known, and you may not be using it every year, but you'll use it again later. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. And you and I were talking before we started this interview that if you make yourself this company and you produce shows under this company and have the puppets and the shows and everything, they become assets, right? From when you're older.
Correct. Yes. Thanks for bringing that up. I get asked a lot about how to start your career, but what do you do when you're a little older? This is the question that we've been asking here in the Bay Area lately, is when you can't do the actual physical manipulation and your voice isn't strong enough to be characters or to do things, what do you have? Well, here at Fairyland, as I said, all of our shows are all contained. They're on tape. They're 20 minutes. They have all the puppets and all the scenery. Well, as I get older, I'll be able to hire younger puppeteers to come in and do those shows. So my shows become an asset. So this is where I've taken my company from where I was doing everything to the future of what do I do when I can't. And I'm hoping that the shows will be used to teach other puppeteers what I've learned and to pass it on.
Yeah, I think that's
play it forward. Because
I think a lot of puppeteers don't think, they just think about, oh, when's my next job and what am I going to do, you know, but thinking of it as you're creating these shows and you're building assets is just an amazing way to look at it.
And you should. And you don't even realize they're assets. I certainly didn't until Art Grunberger came up and said, guess what? I can retire. And I said, what do you mean? I said, you're going to do this till you're 80. And he said, I thought so too. But my money advisor said, no, you have shows. They're contained. You can actually step back and hire somebody to do your job and still keep your shows out there and still keep your name going. And somebody else gets to learn from doing the shows.
Right.
Much like Bob Baker did.
Yeah. And you make a little money, too.
And you make money,
which isn't always bad.
Split the fee.
Right.
Or maybe 30-70. I don't know. It depends.
Well, you just mentioned Bob Baker, and you left the Bay Area to go work with Bob Baker, and we told a little bit about that. But how did that decision to go down there come about?
Well, all through my time here at Fairyland, even though I've been working for Fairyland all the years, 50 years now, I always like to break away and do things. And the directors always wanted me to go pursue other things. And I said, I'd like to go to L.A. out of college. I just graduated in 1985. And I said, I want to go and learn how to build large marionettes and how to do variety-style puppetry. Would that be okay? And my director said, sure, you can go live in L.A. for a year and a half, but you have to come back once a month because I'm going to give you work to take to L.A. And you have to complete it and then come back and share it with us. So I worked at Bob's for a year and a half, and then I was also doing Fairyland stuff and coming back all the time. But Bob's was a place that I really wanted to get involved with because he was doing children's puppetry, but in a review style. And I hadn't done that yet. And it was amazing to talk to Bob. And we had a one-on-one, he and I. He would sit in his workshop all hours of the night because he was a night owl. Mm-hmm. So I knew that if I came by the theater at 1 a.m, he was going to be there painting faces for Disney or doing something. And so he and I would just sit and talk, and the things I learned from him were just wonderful. Of course, he had all his adages too. Some of them come to mind. He'd always tell me, a fine craftsman is a fine sander. All machines are different. Or my favorite is, slow down, be patient, produce quality work, not quantity work. So he had all these wonderful little idioms that he would pass on. Mm-hmm. But Bob was a character. And I learned more by just listening and watching to him than anybody else I mentored with. And I was fortunate to be able to do that. Yeah. Of course, he was a trickster, too. I remember my first time coming to the theater. We were going to start a new show, and he hadn't introduced me to any of the puppeteers there. And these were some very good puppeteers. King Hall, Roy Raymond, Tom Ray. And he was mad at them, and I was coming to learn. And so he dragged me into the theater, and he goes, okay, he goes, this is Randal. He has decided to come here and share his talents with all of you, and I want you to listen to him because he knows how to do a show, and he knows what he's doing, and you guys can learn a lot because you're just not doing what I want. And he berated them for a while, and then he walked out the door, and I stood there, and I looked at them. They just looked at me, and I just shrugged my shoulders, and we all started laughing. Because apparently Bob did this a lot.
Yeah.
He's always making us look further than what we were doing or trying to find ways to push us. And this was his way of pushing these very talented men. I just looked at them and said, I don't know the first thing about working these puppets. I came here to learn. And from then on, we were best of friends.
Yeah. Well, you are the director of the Storybook Theater here at Fairyland. And can you talk a little bit about what that job entails?
Well, basically, I'm in charge of producing 7 shows a year here at the Fairyland Theater. I'm in charge of also training a puppeteer to work with me. Now, that puppeteer is not really a full-fledged puppeteer. These are people who run the rides. They're young kids who are basically trying to separate their days from pushing buttons to pulling strings to make the day go faster. So I may get a really talented person, which I do a lot, who goes on to other things, or I get somebody who just can barely work a puppet. But that's the way my contract is set up. It takes 2 people to do the shows here, but they're only going to pay 1, which is me.
Right.
So I'm in charge of getting these shows on the boards, and that means I have to choose stories from fairy tales or classic novels or operas or ballets or cultural themes. But I have to try to present 7 different shows a year. I have right now 150 different shows I can choose from.
Wow.
Yeah, so quite a lot of work.
Yeah.
Of course, we, like Disney, we bring back the most popular every 7 years. So they do cycle through.
Mm-hmm. And you also, we spoke when we first met about this, that some of your older shows sometimes have to get reworked for modern audiences.
Definitely, right? Definitely. Yeah. I have a lot of Lewis's shows that I like to do, but they were written in the 60s. And so there are terms we cannot use anymore, such as the term stupid. You can't say that anymore. No longer can we can Gretel push the witch in the oven? That is a no-no. I have an awful hard time with knights who win princesses by slaying dragons and such. Mm-hmm. That's why we went to make it a princess who slayed the dragon to win the prince.
Right.
That was okay. So there are a lot of different social values that have changed. Luckily, I have the scripts, I have the music, and I'm able to rewrite the show and re-record it. I have tons of friends who are equity actors in the Bay Area here who want nothing more than to be a puppet voice in a production here. So I'm not hurting for talent, but I do lose some of the great talents we have had doing the show before. Like Ralph Chesay, who was a Shakespearean actor, and he did Ben Gunn in Treasure Island here, and the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. And of course, we can't use those recordings anymore because there was something in them that needed to be changed. Mm-hmm. But it's my job to oversee the shows and to make sure that we have a good wealth of stories for the kids. Lately, I've been pushing a lot of cultural tales. Lewis was a world traveler, and all the time I knew him, every summer he was going off to another different part of the world, and then he was coming back with a tale from that country he went to. So I was sort of raised on this idea that there is a wealth of multicultural tales. Find them and bring them into the puppet theater. And right now, since the Bay Area is a huge melting pot of diverse people, that's working really well. Yeah. We've done tales from Tibet. We've done tales from the Alaskan Indians. We've done them from Russia, Poland. This year, for the first time, we're going to be doing an Indian fairy tale from India based on the Panchatantra. Wow. Which is lots of fun. We've never done any tales from India before. Well, and the theater also here, you do different styles of puppetry as well, right? Correct, yeah. I like to do what we call classical puppetry, which is basically hand, rod, and marionettes. And it just depends on what the story says. If I'm doing a very intimate tale where I want very precise movements, I'll do a hand puppet because the hand gets so much expression for the puppets. And if I'm doing something that I like the costumes to show out in, we'll do a marionette show because that can be more of a grand scheme where you have to see the whole puppet. Or if I'm doing just a simple tale and I'm going to just move the puppets quickly, I'll do a rod puppet show. Although we have done Boon Raku and we have done Shadows. And just recently we did a show by Nick Barone, another puppeteer who we unfortunately have lost. But he gave us the puppets in the show, and I loved it so much. It's sort of a takeoff on the Muppet Show, and they're all Muppety-type characters, but it's all about a monsters who have to put on a variety show. And the kids love it. It's called Tricks or Treats. Yeah. So we have done one in the style of moving mouth puppets. Do you have a favorite style to work in? No, not really, because I just like doing all different types. Yeah. Some things work easier than others, but I have no favorite style. Well, and I think you touched upon this earlier, but you're a builder as well, right? You build? Yes, I build a lot of the puppets too. Yeah. And paint the scenery and do the whole bit. Do you think there is value in a puppeteer learning how to build, or at least having a basic knowledge of how to build? Yes, like I said, you should know everything. I think a well-rounded puppeteer knows how to do it all. Lewis always used to say, you're never going to be 100% at everything, but at least get some percentage on some of all these different things that you can do, and then excel at what you do best.
Yeah.
But a puppeteer who knows how to build will then know how to perform also, because they know how it all put together. So it's good to be well-rounded.
Yeah. Well, performing so many shows and writing so many shows, mostly for families over the years, what advice could you give to a performer who would like to do shows for families?
I would say just be sure that you choose a show that everybody's going to want to see to begin with. Don't do anything really too obscure. Don't do Don Juan in Hell. It's not going to work for the birthday parties.
Right.
It's not something you're going to want. Do something that will be good, like Three Pigs. That's good for birthday parties and families. And then write it for adults, but write it for all ages. But primarily aimed for adults, because they're the ones that have to sit there with the little guys.
Right.
The little ones are going to like it no matter what. In fact, the little ones are going to pick up something new every time they see it. And they're going to want to keep coming back again and again to see it. Can't tell you how many times I finish a show and I'll walk out to take a bow, and somebody in the front row says, "Do it again." And I'll say, "No, only once."
Come back at 3:30.
Come back again later.
Yeah.
But do write for the adults, but have a lot of movement and scenic values and action and comedy for the kids.
You mentioned that you have a young, eager performer who's coming here and apprenticing with you. Does this still happen? Do you still, like you did with Lewis, have people knock on the door and say, "I want to be a puppeteer"?
Very rare. Very rare. I'm glad that my young protege is here right now, because when Lewis left me all of his shows, there was one string involved in the whole thing. He said, "Leave them to somebody else. Let them continue on." So I'm now looking for somebody of a younger age who will come in and learn puppetry the right way. And if they excel at it, then I can do the same thing that Lewis did. Put their name on the contract, get them in the door. And then they have a job here at Fairyland. Because Fairyland's really lucky to have a full-time permanent theater.
Yeah.
You won't find that in very many spaces.
Well, let me ask you this, and I think we spoke about this last time we talked, but was there ever any desire, working with puppets and studying around with the Muppets, was there ever any desire to try and go after television and film, or was it always just the puppet theater?
I consciously know there was no desire to go into film and all. I was just lucky that I was able to do the one-on-one acting with an audience here with the puppets. I've done some film puppetry. Mm-hmm. And I've traveled with a circus even doing shows. But I just like being able to present the shows here at the park and telling a story. That's my 100% mark.
Well, I think it's so great for people to hear about the theater and the puppet theater, because a lot of times I think when puppeteers are starting out, they're like, "I want to be on television. I want to do the Muppets, or I want to be in the Muppets." And that's so hard in itself. It's like, no, there's other ways you could be doing puppetry and make a wonderful living and have a great time.
That's interesting, because in the 50s and the 70s, those were our influx of puppeteers in America. The 50s due to all of the TV shows and all the hosts and things. The 70s due to the Muppets. Mm-hmm. And everybody wants to be a Muppeteer and they want to get into the Muppet style. But it's sort of like the computer industry. There's only so many jobs in that field that you're going to fill them up rather quickly. So yeah, everybody go learn the Muppet style. But I think a lot of the people who are working with the Muppets right at the moment are now branching off into the classical theater style of puppetry. I'm sure you've interviewed a lot of your hosts already who are doing things on stage, whether it's Little Shop of Horrors or Carnival or any of those big musical things, or they're doing avant-garde presentations. Puppet Slam is very popular,
right? Very
theatrical. Or working for marionette theaters and other companies, or just going into teaching or whatever. So they're kind of being a Muppeteer, but they're also becoming a more well-rounded puppeteer.
Well, and as you mentioned before we started talking, before we started recording, that Jim loved those other styles of puppetry. It wasn't all just about the Muppets.
Yes, he didn't want everybody to be like him. He wanted everybody to embrace all the different styles of puppetry that there are.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, you are heavily involved in the San Francisco Guild of Puppetry, and you've been both the president and vice president. Why do you think puppetry guilds are so important?
I think they're important because they're a place to meet people of like minds. So much today, people are looking towards the internet and they're looking towards other seclusionary ways of learning things, that they're not having a social aspect of meeting another puppeteer. I think that if you have an idea and you go to a guild, you may find that someone has done that before and can help you do it, or you may find another person of a like mind who will want to do that project with you. So I think that guilds are a very important way to advance yourself through networking personally and meeting different styles of puppeteers.
And of course, we here in the San Francisco Bay Area and down in Los Angeles, we have guilds, but you can start a guild anywhere, right?
Yes, you can start a guild anywhere, but then you have to have it chartered by the P of A. The San Francisco Guild chartered itself in 1960. It actually started meeting in 1954, but it chartered itself in 1960 because it wanted to have money to put on a convention.
Right.
And the Puppeteers of America would give you money if you chartered your guild.
And how long have you been involved with the guild here in San Francisco or the Bay Area?
For close to 50 years now.
50 years?
Since 1970, yeah.
Yeah.
It's getting up there. Yeah.
Well, you've also written several books, and I would love to talk about two of them. Can you tell us a little bit about Storybook Strings?
Storybook Strings. We did that as the history of the Fairyland Puppet Theater. It's a book about all the different people that have worked in the theater, their talents and their stories. Again, hoping that somebody will pick it up and go, wow, this person had an interesting puppet career. Listening to your broadcasts are so important because you're hearing people talk about their puppet careers. Well, we did that in the book Storybook Strings. It's 50 years of Fairyland Puppet Theater with pictures and stories on how they became puppeteers.
And Jerry Juhl did the foreword for it.
Jerry Juhl was kind enough to come in and do the foreword, talking about his first experience meeting the guild, coming from Minnesota, I believe is where he came from.
Yeah.
And here he was in the bohemian middle of San Francisco with all the beatniks. And he's very funny in his foreword of the book.
And then you had Alan Cook wrote is it the afterword or the last word?
We called the forward and the backward.
The backward, there you go.
We called it the backward because Alan Cook wrote it from the historical standpoint of why it was important to have the Fairyland Puppet Theater. But at the time that I wrote the book, we had such a rich history and nobody knew about it. We were just this little tiny puppet theater and amusement park.
Yeah. Well, the other book I want to talk about, because I think it's the history book is fascinating, but I think this book is amazing too, is Making Puppets the Fairyland Way, which I think is really unique because you just lay out the plans of how the puppets here at the theater are built.
Very unusual because we have to build shows fast. So we don't have time to carve out of wood a lot of times or spend a lot of time doing intricate things. Our puppets are often made just very simple and doll-like. And these patterns were designed by Letty Schubert, Louis Mollman, and Marion Derby. And we've given you patterns for building marionettes, hand puppets, and rod puppets. The patterns are actually the patterns we use here at the Fairyland Puppet Theater. And also, when I was starting to be a puppeteer, there was a book called Presenting Marionettes, which was, of course, done by Susan French. And I loved that book as a kid because it gave you black and white photographs on how she did everything as she was building the puppets. So as I present the patterns in this book, I have black and white photographs on how to do every step. Because oftentimes when you write a book that tells you how to do something, you begin to talk in layman's terms or in things that people wouldn't understand, made up terms for whatever. And I've done that many times myself. Where I've read a pattern and didn't understand what the wording was. So the pictures help establish how to use the patterns. And this allows any puppeteer to very quickly start to build puppets and start to produce their own puppet theater. And once you get the patterns and once you know how to work them, then you can do anything with them.
Yeah.
They're jumping off points.
Right. You can start building your assets like we talked about earlier.
Start building the assets, bring them here, and you can have my job. Yes. But it just creates puppeteers. It's a way of starting another generation.
Yeah. It's an amazing book, and I highly recommend, and we were talking about learning to build before. It's a great starting place to learn how to build.
And again, I'll preface it by saying that in order to build the patterns in this book, you only need a sewing machine. Mm-hmm. It's all done on a sewing machine and stuffed felt, and it's all making doll-like puppets.
Yeah.
But you can later on do sculpted heads or whatever you'd like. But you got to start with the basics. Learn how to do the simple things first, and then take those patterns and make them much more majestic and broad.
Well, I also hear that you're working on another book about California puppeteers. Why do you think preserving that history is so important?
Our next book we feel is important because you can learn from reading about other puppeteers. So we are doing a century of California puppeteers, or how the West was strung. So we're trying to show that puppeteers came in different decades, and they all had interesting careers. But more importantly, as you read from the way back in the 1920s, coming into the modern age today, puppetry built on the people who were there in the past. So as you read their careers, as you go further into the book, you realize that the people who are further ahead in the book learn from the ones you've already read. And so as a community, we have built on each other. And puppeteers are very sharing. They're very kind. And so we're putting all of these names down in this book so that in the future somebody can look back at it and say, wow, we had a great wealth of puppetry here in California.
Yeah. Well, I'm very much looking forward to that book, and I think it's going to be, it's definitely one I'm going to be purchasing. In 2016, you were recognized by the mayor of Oakland for your dedication to puppetry. Did you ever think that this career would lead you to be honored by the mayor?
Well, I'm very honored to have been honored by her. Actually, the Fairyland Puppet Theater, I'm the third one to get that honor. In 2002, Mayor Jerry Brown announced Louis Molman Day for all of his work. And then in 2006, when the theater turned 50, the entire city council put together a whole draft announcing Storybook Puppet Theater Day here in Oakland. So I'm the third one now to be able to say I've had that honor. My director put me in for the recommendation, but the mayor of Oakland, Libby Shaft, she is actually a Fairyland fairy tale personality. So when she was a young girl, she was Cinderella and Raggedy Ann here at the park. So she grew up with Fairyland, and not only that, but her voice is still heard in our Raggedy Ann puppet show. She's still the lead as a 10-year-old.
Yeah.
So
well, she knows the importance of this place.
She loves Fairyland, and I'm very honored that she did it. But what comes around goes around, and we're 6 degrees of separation. You start talking to somebody, and suddenly you realize that they know somebody you know, or they've done what you've done. And so that's kind of what we're all about here at Fairyland.
Yeah. Did you get to do anything special on your day? Did you get like free food at restaurants or something like that?
No. In fact, I didn't even know it was my day till, I guess it was about 9 o'clock in the evening. That's when they gave me the award.
That's how they get you.
They said, here, you've got this award. It's your day here.
And for 3 more hours. Yes, enjoy.
We were doing an adult puppet slam here in Fairyland, and they gave it to me as part of the award for Fairyland's Storybook Theater 60th anniversary, as well as our Puppet Slam, the only one we've ever done here at Fairyland for adults.
Yeah. Well, in your opinion, as we wrap up here, why is the Storybook Theater in Fairyland such an important place?
I think it's an important place because it gives the community a place to come and see quality puppetry for families and for young children. It has a theater where young talents can come and hopefully become future puppeteers by joining in on some of the projects here. The Puppet Theater has also been fortunate enough to have many great artists and actors come through here who became part of our Fairyland Puppet Theater. So the Puppet Theater has been like the place to go to have a good time and to create art. So I think as such, that's why it's such an important icon, because for 63 years it has been the meeting place of not only the San Francisco Guild of Puppeteers, but also of like-minded individuals who wanted to learn about puppetry or just be entertained by puppetry.
Well, that's amazing, and my plan is to have you back on the show where we can talk about the history of the Storybook Theater, because I also think that needs to get down here, on record as well. Not that it hasn't, but I just would love to have that on the show. But as we wrap up here, my last question I like to ask is, what has been the highlight of your career so far?
The highlight of my career? I'd have to say the highlight of my career is seeing some of the people who I've been able to personally take a hand in training go on and become successful, to make their own careers, like Alice Deneen, who was here back when I was running the theater, but to have excelled and to have gone beyond what we gave them, beyond what they may have learned, but to make it their own. I think that's a highlight. I'm reminded of, if I might, a quote from Star Wars, which is very funny.
Sure.
I just recently watched The Last Jedi again, and Yoda is in there talking.
Yes, as a puppet.
As a puppet,
As a puppet, so beautiful. I've talked about this on the podcast before. It's amazing.
Yes, there's Frank, our Fairyland person, coming back here as a puppet and giving advice, and Luke is going on about his problems. But being a mentor to these people is to tell them all about your life, the good things and the bad things, to let them know that you have fallen and you have gotten up and gotten to better heights. And Yoda says that the greatest teacher failure is, he says, we are what they grow beyond. And he goes, that is the true burden of all masters. I think that's true, to let your students go beyond what you teach them, because they're using you as the stepping stone. And, it's kind of an honor to be allowed that to happen.
Yeah. Well, Randal, if people want to reach out and to find out what's going on here at the Fairyland and the Storybook Theater, where can they go to find that information?
To find out about Fairyland, it's at fairyland.org. They have a website which tells you about Fairyland and tells you the shows we're doing. If you'd just like to see what I'm doing, I have a very, very small, not very fancy website that they could go to. It's www.puppetcompany, all spelled out, puppetcompany.com. And it's just very simple. No moving parts, just what do we do? And you can contact me through that entity.
Yeah. Well, and I highly recommend, if puppeteers, if you can get to the Bay Area, definitely come to Storybook Fairyland and the Storybook Theater, because you just feel the history. You feel how amazing this place is. And Randal, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time.
I'd just like to say one thing real quick. Please come and see the theater. And I know we have a rule that says you have to have a child to come into the park. We have no adults without children, no children without adults. But please call ahead and I will arrange for you to be able to come in and see the Fairyland Theater. And I'll personally show you around grounds.
That's right. And that's what you did the first time we were here. And we certainly appreciated it. And we're glad that it opened this door. It's like you said, don't be afraid to ask.
Just ask.
They say is no. But Randal, thank you so much for taking the time, and I look forward to talking to you again here on Under the Puppet.
Thank you so much.
Many thanks to Randal Metz for being on the show, and to Children's Fairyland for letting us record at the workshop. I'll have links to Randal's Puppet Company and the Storybook Theater at Children's Fairyland in the show notes for this episode number 27, over at underthepuppet.com. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Under the Puppet. I welcome your feedback via email at hello@SaturdayMorningMedia.com or via Twitter, where you can find the show at username Under the Puppet. You can also find the show on Facebook simply by searching Under the Puppet. I want to hear your suggestions for questions I should be asking and for future guests. Let me know who I should be talking to. Thank you so much for listening. Talk to you next time right here on Under the Puppet. This episode of Under the Puppet featured music by Dan Ring and was edited by Steven Staver. Under the Puppet is a production of Saturday Morning Media and is made possible by the Saturday Morning Media Patreon patrons who've gone to patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media and set up a monthly pledge for as little as $1 a month. Patrons get new episodes before they are released, behind-the-scenes information, and exclusive bonus content. If you'd like to support this show and the other fun content from Saturday Morning Media, become a patron. Head on over to patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media and set up your monthly pledge today. You can also tell a friend about the show or leave the show a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening. Under the Puppet is copyright 2019 Saturday Morning Media Grant Pachoco executive producer. All rights reserved. www.saturdaymorningmedia.com. You've been listening to Saturday Morning Media. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.